have Anna Oppenheim with us this evening. She is on the Momentum National Coordinating Group. And finally, this evening, we have Johnbosco Nwogbo, who is my colleague at We Own It, which is the campaign for public ownership of public services. So as I said, hopefully Claire will be joining us very shortly. If she has forgotten, then maybe the more you share the Facebook stream, the more likely she is to see it and be reminded that she should be on this Zoom call now. But I'm going to do everything I can to try and get her on the call and part of the conversation as quickly as possible. So we've got 4 questions that we're going to be tackling this evening. They're 4 incredibly important and big questions. And each of our panelists has a huge amount of insightful and informed things to say about them. The questions have all been submitted in advance by people registering their interest in this event. And the first of those questions comes the day after the easing of some of the lockdown restrictions, with pubs reopening yesterday. I'm sure many people will be watching this back on Wednesday after the second evening in a row back in a pub. But it comes after some of those restrictions have eased. And the question is, are we now on the right path out of lockdown? And I'm going to come first on this one to Bob.
Thank you, Chris. Just a little background on where we are as a country. Compared to the rest of the world, the UK has unfortunately suffered one of the highest death rates in the world. And for a country which used to pride itself on having a universal national health service, we have performed particularly bad. And the reason is we've had 10 years of austerity-driven cuts and defunding to the NHS. Our response has unfortunately continued to follow those ideological motivators. And initially we ignored the coronavirus, and then we responded quite late and had to have a draconian and prolonged lockdown, and we're just coming out of another lockdown. It's not all been bad news. The one thing that has gone very well, and primarily driven by the NHS, is the vaccination program. So we've vaccinated more than half the population who have received 1 vaccine, and several million have received a second vaccine. So in a way, that significant group, the most vulnerable amongst us, the people most likely to end up needing hospital care, ending up in ITU and potentially dying, they have received the vaccine. So that gives them significant protection. And we know people who are vaccinated are far less likely to become seriously ill, and very few will end up dying if they come in contact with the virus. That's the good news. The bad news has been the government's doubling down on what has been a catastrophically rolled out, predominantly private sector operated test and trace system. So adding to the 22 billion that was handed over to Serco and Deloitte to operate the test and trace system, they've been promised another 15 billion, bringing that up to 37 billion. They have performed badly when we look at the other pillar of the test and trace system run by the NHS. The comparative performance is a lot weaker, and the responsiveness and also the uptake of screening has been poor. So it's something like only 1 in 5 people who have symptoms actually present themselves for testing. And that's down to poor communication. A lot of the public still don't understand what the main symptoms are. The list of symptoms that people have been given are very narrow. So there's a problem of public education. There's still confusion over clear messaging. And the other reason we've done so badly is the catastrophic, inadequate financial support that's been offered to people. Now, neither has the test and trace system been fixed, neither the support on offer, the financial support to the most vulnerable, the highest risk groups, people who have to go out to work, otherwise they don't feed the family, that has not been fixed. And it's quite likely, given not everybody has yet been vaccinated, that as we ease out of lockdown, we will have more infections. So although the vaccination rollout program has been very successful, we're one of the leading countries in terms of rollout, there is still a risk of an increasing caseload of patients who are sick with it. But the most vulnerable groups are protected. The other problem I have is the lack of mitigation. So the reopening of schools, but having full-size classrooms without necessary changes being made to ventilation systems, and having fewer pupils in the classroom. Those were simple measures that the government could have put in place, which will make any potential surge in infection reduce the risk and reduce the number of people being affected. So it's a mixed story. There's certainly been a huge squandering of public money that should have been reinvested in the NHS, local councils, and strengthening the public health systems that were decimated following the 2012 Health and Social Care Act. So vaccination going well, but we haven't learned the lessons from the failures of the last year in test and trace and supporting people.
Thank you, Bob. So just an update, I have still not heard from Claire, but I am doing my best to bring her to you this evening. But in the meantime, I'm going to come over to Johnbosco on this one. So are we now on the right path to get out of lockdown safely?
Well, I think that Bob pretty much covers every angle of this question, but I wanted to quickly highlight two specific elements of what he already touched on, because we on it has run campaigns specifically around track and trace, and I happen to be a strong believer in what I believe to be one of the most promising ideas that could potentially have, if it had been introduced earlier on, could have dealt with the problem of that Bob identifies, the problem of people not identifying themselves for testing, or people not isolating themselves once they've been tested and identified to be positive. That is the question of financial support for people. On the question of test and trace, just to put people in perspective, Circle is the company that has run the national effort to identify people who have been, who have contracted the virus, and to advise them to isolate themselves so as not to infect other people with it. Of course, throughout this process, the government has made a quite purposeful effort to deceive people that that particular program has been run by the NHS. So they've been trying to call it NHS track and trace, but it is not. It's been run by Circle, and over again, every single month, they've been found to reach contact rates of around 57, 58, 59% of close contacts. That's quite pathetic, given the fact that scientists say we ought to be reaching levels of up to 80%, right? In order for track and trace to actually do the job that track and trace is supposed to help us do. And some scientists have actually identified that if track and trace had actually done its job, we would not have needed to go into the second lockdown, right? And as we sit here right now, talking about whether or not we're on the right track out of lockdown, if we have not gotten track and trace right, there is a significant risk that as we continue not to get it right, of course, there is the added element now of millions or tens of millions of doses of the vaccine having been dispensed. But there is still a significant risk that having not gotten track and trace right, we run the risk of more people dying unnecessarily. We run the risk of potentially having to kind of pull back some of these newfangled freedoms that we are enjoying now. So I think that we're not on the right track out of track and trace. The government continues to pretend that track and trace has been a success. It has been an outstanding failure. I mean, if you set yourself a project and you wanted to design a failed project, you would design something that looks very much like track and trace, the track and trace that the government has done. So we're not on the right track out of lockdown there. But on the other hand, there is also the question of the economic insecurities that have been created and deepened by this crisis. And I think I was reading something the other day about a document released by the Library of the House of Commons, where it was found that households in the higher income percentiles, actually saved a great deal of money over the period of this pandemic, whereas households in the lower income percentiles, went deeper into debt during this pandemic. And the government, I mean, giving somebody 80% of their already deplorable wage does not go anywhere in solving their problem. And the government is not addressing that. And there doesn't appear to be any explicit effort to address that in the public domain. And I think that when the numbers go back up, as I imagine they will, because I've seen the pictures and it's not looking pretty. When the numbers go back up and we have to begin to caution people again about social gatherings, we will find that we will have the same problems we had the first time around. People not presenting themselves to be tested because they don't want to be told that they're positive because of what that means for their employment and for other things. And also people who have tested positive who then do not isolate. And in this connection, I think that the government should explore the possibility of some form of basic income over the coming months. I would have preferred it much earlier in this process. I think it would have done a marvelous job in dealing with that gap between people being tested and found positive and people isolating. But I don't think it's too late to do that now. And I think that would certainly put us on the right track out of lockdown.
Thank you so much, Johnbosco. And I believe Clare is now with us. But Clare, I'll give you a moment or two to get your bearings before I bring you into this conversation. And then come to Anna next. But before I do, just wanted to send a reminder to everyone watching on Facebook. If you're enjoying this debate, if you're enjoying this conversation, if you're enjoying this event, other people that you know will enjoy it too. So make sure you hit that share button. Make sure that it appears in more people's feeds. Make sure we get more people watching this. We have over a dozen people watching now. I said at the start we can hit 100. I think we can, but we can only do that with your help if you share this stream and make sure that more people are watching it too. So Anna, I'm going to bring you in next. And so what Johnbosco is saying there, we had a lot of criticism of the government's policy on it. Do you think that the stuff that Johnbosco identified there around the failing test and trace system, around the lack of income support, and so on, is going to undermine any easing of lockdown and mean that we'll end up in a similar situation in a few months' time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with all the points identified already. I wanted to start on a positive point, actually. I think we've all had a difficult year and we deserve a little bit of cautious optimism. We've seen cases going down, hospitalizations going down, importantly, deaths going quite sharply down because of the vaccination program, which is, by far our strongest weapon in the long-term fight against COVID. We shouldn't give the government too much credit here, although we're seeing a little bit of vaccine bounce in the polls. The program is run by the NHS, by hardworking healthcare workers. The vaccines have been produced by brilliant scientists from all over the world, using huge amounts of public money contributed by governments globally. Of course, in the UK, vaccination is going good. In the US, the EU is also speeding up, but that's unfortunately not the case around the world. In a lot of the global south, countries are only starting to really vaccinate populations. And if we care about international travel, if we care about stopping dangerous variants emerging that might be less responsive to vaccines, or of course, if we care about saving lives internationally, so it's something we should be concerned about. And in fact, it is countries like the UK, like the EU, like the US, that are stopping international efforts to waive intellectual property rights and to allow to massively increase production of vaccines to make sure that the world gets to a better stage and we end the pandemic sooner. So that will be kind of my first appeal for the UK government to really lead the efforts for a so-called people's vaccine to massively scale up productions and vaccinate everyone around the world and not just in the UK. Secondly, I would appeal to the government to stick to its promise to lead the easing of lockdown by daytime, not dates. It seems maybe like the government is starting to learn the lessons of the past year, but over and over again, we've seen the economy being prioritized over saving human lives. And in effect, the government failed to protect either. So our kind of like goals and targets and reopening times need to be reassessed regularly depending on where cases continue to go up and down. A third appeal is for us all to learn the lessons of the pandemic. People have already mentioned that a lot of people were simply unable to self-isolate because they couldn't afford to. The UK has one of the lowest rates of sick pay in Europe. I think that's unacceptable. And we've talked about it loads throughout the pandemic, and it's still the case. It has not gone up. And this is something that will affect us and will affect people like far beyond COVID, right? We cannot afford to get ill. We should also talk about migrants, the fact that a lot of people have no recourse to public funds. And if they lose their jobs, like many people have out of no fault of theirs whatsoever, many are left homeless and destitute. And that has continued to be the case, despite everyone experiencing difficulties throughout this year. And then finally, we need to talk about recovery and what our recovery will look like. I mean, Build Back Better has been a slogan that's thrown around loads, but what is actually behind it? And we should not repeat the mistakes of the last financial crisis, when austerity has both caused untold hardship, but also slowed down growth and slowed down recovery. We should be investing, but we should be investing in green jobs, not forgetting the other crisis that we're facing, which is the climate crisis. We should be investing in care jobs, and the Women's Budget Group has done some amazing work around how expanding the care sector can be part of building a kind of new, more equal and greener economy. And as Johnbosco rightly identified, tackling inequality, which has contributed to deaths and which has grown even bigger throughout this crisis. So, instead of just repeating Build Back Better, we should actually take action and imagine what a post-COVID society would look like. And I would like to see the Labour Party, my own party as well, trying to lead a bit of that as well and put forward a vision because, we've discovered how inequality affects all of us. The vital role of key workers, migrant workers play in our society, and these people need to be appreciated. And we all kind of depend on one another.
Thank you, Anna. So Claire, I'm going to bring you in next on this one. Now, apologies that you missed a lot of what's already been said, but we're discussing at the moment whether we're currently on the right path out of lockdown. Now, obviously, a lot of the decisions around the restrictions and around lockdown are devolved issues. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit if you think, I guess, that Northern Ireland is on the right path out of lockdown, but also your reflections on the rest of the UK as well.
Thanks very much, Chris. Apologies for my lateness. We'll not blame technology, but it was me. But yeah, are we on the right path out of lockdown? To be quite honest with you, looking at the UK, so if the pictures from Soho last night were anything to go by, then I would say no. But I mean, it's undoubted we have had a really, really tough year. People have had a really, really tough year, and COVID has been relentless. And lockdown has turned everything on its head. And yes, our inequalities have been exposed and the inequities have been completely laid bare. But I think that we really do need to acknowledge as well that we can be in no doubt that this global pandemic is just a small outworking of what we should expect from the impact of climate breakdown. We already know as well that the world and its medical experts are already planning for the next pandemic that they're sure is on the way. We just don't have a name for it yet. But I also don't believe that people are being given the real picture with COVID either. There is no post-COVID, and we need to really understand what that means, that COVID is here to stay, and we'll have to learn to live with it, and urgently need to adapt to the new normal as it's been coined. But what is that new normal needs to be explored, and those conversations need to be had urgently. But yes, here in Northern Ireland, I mean, again, we can have a look at it. It's really, really shown in this past year that this 5-party power sharing executive model that we do have is really incapable of dealing with a crisis. And whether that be this COVID crisis or the mental health crisis that we have, the housing crisis that we have, the low wage economy, the climate crisis, all these crises are just building up. And we have a 5-party power sharing executive that rarely agree on a way forward and therefore fail to deliver time and time again. But I've heard what Anna was saying there about, being data-driven rather than date-driven. And we have eventually taken that approach here from the executive in Northern Ireland. So we are looking at the data before we announce any dates. So this week, for example, it was just on Monday that we had all our school children return to school. It was in a staged phase up until then. We don't have, our pubs are not open, our beer gardens are not open, our hairdressers are not back open, our shops are not back open. And we're expecting more announcements on Thursday to see if we can move a wee bit further. But we have had loads of lost opportunities, not just in Northern Ireland, but across the island, about how we could have dealt with COVID and did our adaptation and mitigation measures. I would be a strong proponent that we should have taken the New Zealand model. We're a small island with a relatively small and manageable population, but yet we couldn't get those cross-border government working together to try and implement that as well. So I think that there has been many opportunities that we have lost here. But the positive, I suppose, is that Northern Ireland is really making great inroads with the vaccine rollout. And I believe that's absolutely because the strategy has been left to the healthcare professionals to manage, and political interference has stepped back and away from that one. But it remains to see how we will, deal with that one, and whether mutant and variant strains will be seen, or how we manage with those as well. But if lockdown is not managed well from here on in, we really do face a repeat of lockdown again next winter. Let's not forget that this is a winter virus. We are exiting winter, and we will have some sort of summer easing going on. But if it's not managed well, come next winter again, we will be right back into the same scenarios in some way, shape or form. But unless we really make the radical changes that we need, and that's going right to the core of our living conditions, our public services, investing in our frontline service workers as well, then we're there, and it goes back to the Green New Deal. Do we want a Green New Deal? And this phrase about build back better, I don't really want to build back better, because what we had before wasn't working. So why do we want to build that back? I want to build better. I want to see a Green New Deal implemented to focus on what we actually need to create a just transition to a society where no one's left behind. And we have the opportunity to do that with this lockdown.
Thank you, Claire, for that. So I'm going to pause there briefly in case anybody wants to jump back in. If they could indicate to me if they do want to respond to anything that's been said using the raise hand button, that'd be great. In the meantime, while I wait to see if that's happening, I just wanted to say, for those of you who are watching on YouTube, please do hit that subscribe button, hit that little bell. It means that you'll get a notification every time we release a video, and you'll never miss one of these debates. Of course, if you're watching on Facebook, as I keep saying, please do share that link. I want to shout out to Vix Louthian and Tina Rothery and Martin Francis and the Blackpool Green Party for already sharing that link. We can get more people sharing it. If you're enjoying this video, if you're enjoying this conversation, somebody else will too. And the only way they'll see it and we'll get more people watching is if you hit that share button. I can see Johnbosco wants to jump back in. So I'll bring Johnbosco in briefly, and then I'll move us on to our second question. So over to you, Johnbosco.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch on a little bit more something that Claire mentioned in her remarks, which I thought were brilliant. This country has been, I think that perhaps it may be a bit of a stretch to compare it to what happened during the Brexit referendum and debates, but I believe that this country has seen a great deal of division over this period, over questions of the vaccine, over questions of the lockdown, over questions of masks, and so on and so forth. I think that a lot of people, a lot of us, I would put it that way, have made the mistake of seeing those questions as purely scientific questions, right? The question of if you wear a mask, you can protect others from the virus and so on and so on. But it's more than more than a scientific question, it's a political question as well, because it's a question of whether or not you trust the government, whether or not you believe the government has your interest at heart, and how likely you are to trust, to believe what the government says in that respect, kind of is related to whether or not you end up deciding to wear a mask, or whether you believe that lockdown is a ploy by the government to steal our freedoms. And I think that we are, as a country, we are not yet fully kind of grappling with the divisions that have been wrought in this country over this period. And I think to the question of whether or not we are on the right path out of lockdown, I don't think that as far as this particular issue is concerned, I don't think we are on a path at all, because we're not even talking about it. And I think we need to talk about it. I think we need to begin to heal some of those divisions. I don't know the extent to which we could restore faith in society as such. I don't believe we should restore faith in this government, but we should restore faith in our collective ability to kind of stare down something as evil as the COVID virus, and deal with it together as a community, make sacrifices together as a community, and come out of it together as a community, as opposed to what we have seen of this kind of the virus exacerbating some of the divisions we already had in our community.
Thanks, Johnbosco. So I can see Anna wants to jump in there. So I'll bring Anna in, and then I'm going to move us onto our next question. If you could be brief, Anna, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I think Johnbosco made a very important point about restoring trust, and restoring trust in each other, I think, is very important, or building if it was never there in the first place. A poll came out today asking people if they trust themselves and the public to behave responsibly after pubs reopen. Only 4% of people said they don't trust themselves, but most people said they don't trust the public. And that's been consistent over the past year, where people think they follow the rules, but no one else does. And actually, overwhelmingly, people want to follow the rules, and if they can afford it, they do. And I think there is some work to be done on telling people that actually we can trust each other, and we can be collaborative, and we can work together. So I think that's an important point you touched on.
Great, thank you, Anna. So as I said, I'm now going to move us on to our second question, which in many ways is linked to that first one. And it comes in the context, I guess, of there being a number of stories this week about the pressures that COVID has put on our NHS, and the scale of the waiting lists that people are on, but also the scale of the mental health crisis for NHS staff, the stress and strain that NHS staff have been under. And the question is, how do we rebuild the NHS after COVID? And I'm going to bring in Johnbosco on this one first.
Thank you very much. I think that's such a brilliant question. And I suppose a good way to approach it would be to ask, who is we? In the question, right? If we're talking about the government, we're fairly certain what the government believes the way to quote unquote rebuild the NHS is. It is to hand off billions of pounds, tens of billions of pounds actually, to private hospital companies to quote unquote cover some of the capacity that they themselves had cut out of the NHS over the last decade. Right, and of course, they have already shown us throughout this pandemic, and statements that they've been making since well, let's not say the end of the pandemic, but since we started kind of feeling like we are getting out of the pandemic, we've had Boris Johnson talk about how private companies gave us the vaccine, or greed gave us the vaccine. We've also been hearing Matt Hancock talk about how it's been partnership between the NHS and private companies that has helped us during this crisis. I think, but if we're talking about we, as in the British public, people who actually care about the NHS, who do not want to chop it up and hand it off to our friends who happen to have a lot of money and own companies that run services that NHS run, then I think that perhaps a good place to start is to identify the fact that we are the vast majority of Britain. We on it ran a poll, I believe it was last month, that found that 76% of the public said that the NHS was so much more effective at dealing with the pandemic than the private companies that have been brought into the service. So Serco, Deloitte, Satel and company. And 75% of us said that we wanted private companies to be kicked out of the NHS after the pandemic. And I think that it says what it says what it means on the tin. We want private companies to be kicked out of the NHS, and I think that is the center of the next fight to keep our NHS, to build our NHS after the pandemic. I think perhaps we could look at it as a long-term fight, a medium-term fight, and a short-term fight. In the short term, there is the fight, of course, as some people may know, to kick companies like Centene, the US healthcare profiteer, out of GP practices across the country. That is a fight that I think that a lot of communities across the country are engaging on right now, and that we ought to support them in. But in the medium term, there is, of course, the question of things like private hospitals being given some of the NHS budget to cover for areas that the government actually created deficiencies or space gaps in the NHS for. They were the ones that cut the bursaries for nurses and created a gap there. They were the ones that cut the beds, I believe about 15,000 beds in the last 10 years, or probably even more. So they created these gaps, and now they're paying their friends to cover those gaps, right? And I think that that is a fight that we ought to fight in the medium term. But in the long term, which is not to say it starts in the distant future, starts relatively soon, is the fight to reinstate the NHS. The fight that a lot of us are kind of talking about as the white paper fight. It's a kind of that gave us an insight into the government's plans for reorganizing the NHS after the white paper was leaked a few weeks ago. That's the fight that we have to, everybody who cares about the NHS really does need to get involved in that fight, to make sure that we actually restore the NHS. I don't like to think about the past necessarily, but I think that on the question of the NHS, I think that its golden era was almost a past era. It was when we still thought of the NHS as something that was high quality, provided high quality healthcare, free at the point of need, right? And now it still provides high quality healthcare compared to a lot of countries in the world. But that quality has been kind of watered down by the fact that private companies who have profit as their highest motive and healthcare as perhaps a second or third motive have been brought into the system, and doctors and nurses and medical professionals who do a great job, who've done a great job in the vaccination program, have over time been sidelined. And we need to reinstate that NHS into what it was originally envisioned as.
Thank you, Johnbosco. I'm going to bring Clare in next on this one. So, Clare, do you agree with Johnbosco's assessment there that central to rebuilding the NHS is kicking out those private companies and reinstating the NHS as a public service?
Absolutely. I mean, the NHS is a public service. It's not a private service. So that should be front and center, obviously. But there's a three-prong approach maybe in terms of how we not just value, but rebuild our NHS, I suppose, moving forward. And I would see those three areas as being firstly acknowledging the essential frontline workers that are there. And it's not just the doctors and the nurses, but it's the porters, the cleaners, the caterers, everybody behind the engine of delivering the services that we all need. They need to be acknowledged, and they need to be given a break as well. So they have just worked for a year solid with little or no time off, working, round the clock, 24/7 as well. So they need acknowledged for that, and they need to be given time to rest up, to look after themselves, first of all. And then I think that a transformation needs to be implemented within the service too. And that has to come hand in hand with the third element, which is that austerity of our health service needs to end. And we need to then to put proper long-term ring-fenced funding behind what it is that we've all valued and been right behind and out on our doorsteps clapping for over this past year. The NHS has suffered defunding before the COVID crisis. It has, we're in a very different position, I suppose, in Northern Ireland than where you are in England and GB as well, with it being devolved. But it was broken before COVID arrived, and we need a huge effort there, and we can't forget that here in Northern Ireland, in the weeks prior to the pandemic hitting, our nurses actually went on strike over pay and parity conditions that had created a really unsafe working conditions due to the fall in staffing levels. This was the first time in the history of our nursing union existing that they'd ever taken strike action, and that was just in the weeks prior to this pandemic. So they were, it was actually working out that because of the pay rate, they couldn't get enough staff. So the staffing levels were low, and it was paying more for nurses to come in and work as agency staff rather than taking on full-time permanent positions within the health trusts as well. So that was creating, this disparity. So rather than it being the amount of money, it was that the pay was not enticing people in as permanent staff and creating those unsafe conditions where nursing staff felt that they couldn't carry out their jobs properly. So that's what we were facing here before the pandemic hit. And while the minister did step in and agree a resolution with pay parity, the underlying conditions still remain on top of the year that has just been. So firstly, we really do need to give our NHS staff the recognition and the reward that they truly deserve. I have been absolutely mesmerised and overawed by the effort and the dedication and the professionalism from each and every person in there, and again, right down to the porters, the cooks, the cleaners, theatre staff, everybody, and what they've been able to do. But there hasn't yet, I would argue, been the requisite courage and political courage I'm talking about to really adapt and transform the healthcare system that we have here in Northern Ireland to make it fit for purpose. We have had so many reports and strategies coming forward, but none of them have been implemented. And we've had in the past, we've had Transforming Your Care, which was a huge effort where civic society and the profession were all involved in coming up with what this reform would look like. And then it was left lying, and we got the next one, which was an expert report, the Bangor report. And that was basically shelved. And we're talking about the transformation of services and where we can access services and where centres of excellence might be placed within our health service estate right across Northern Ireland as well. But our services have been allowed to deteriorate really because leaders haven't had the courage to implement the necessary changes, because all these strategies and reports that we've had to date have shown that we have been, that our model that we're currently trying to uphold is outdated. It is not fit for purpose, but yet the update hasn't happened. And then again, that has to go along with, deliberate austerity. And austerity has to continue to be challenged and resisted, as an economic response to this pandemic. I'm really fearful that on top of the Tory austerity that we've already seen, that we're now going to get further austerity measures, and that will be couched or framed within the economic recovery from the pandemic as well. And you've already mentioned mental health rates or just waiting lists. Northern Ireland had the highest waiting lists in the whole of the UK. We are not even a huge population. We have a population of 1.8 million people in Northern Ireland. I mean, that's the equivalent of a large city in England, and that's our whole population. And we still can't manage a health service fit for purpose and fit for the modern day on those numbers. We have suicide death rates in Northern Ireland. We have more people have died by suicide since 1998 in the Good Friday Agreement than there ever was, killed or murdered during the decades of conflict. So our mental health crisis is really, really stark and huge in numbers here. And that level of intergenerational trauma by our failure to deal with legacy and conflict is just making and exasperating the problem tenfold as well. But on a sort of a plus, I would say our minister today, he did announce some measures that he was coming forward with to help ease the strain and try and rebuild our health services. But again, it's all predicated on short-term funding because the long-term strategy and economics behind it just aren't there. And while he fully acknowledges that and is critical of that himself, and he knows is not the solution, but without that transformation along with the funding, our services will remain largely the same. So it's political courage that we need in Northern Ireland, because what we're having is we need a huge overhaul of our system, which is really predicated on a long-term systemic strategy. But that has been tasked to politicians and ministers to deliver, who are then on short-term electoral cycles. So when you're threatening to maybe either close or relocate a hospital, even if it's for good intention to make a service more professional, modern, or updated, nobody wants to see that removed from their local community. So when votes are threatened or at risk, then what we see is power bases are protected over what is right and what is actually needed. So there's a huge way to go, really, in terms of delivering and overhauling our health service here. But the first acknowledgement needs to go to those who have just been through what they've done for everybody in the past year within the health service.
Thanks, Claire, for that. So I am next going to come to Anna on this one. So how do we rebuild our NHS post-COVID?
Thank you. I know there's a lot of people on this panel with great expertise in NHS reform. So I think I'll listen more than speak on this one. But there's a few basic points that I think are worth making. I mean, first point, obviously money and funding. And I felt just personally scared when I started getting texts over the winter about how I shouldn't call an ambulance now because there's no capacity. And that's a situation that should never be allowed to repeat itself. We need serious investment in the NHS, not like vanity project like Nightingale hospitals, but serious investment to make sure that no one is left behind. And I'm very glad that the mental health crisis has been mentioned. That's obviously not new, but throughout the pandemic, we've seen increasing rates of self-harm, of eating disorders, especially among young people, of young people saying they're unable to cope. And as someone with personal experience of similar issues, I find it quite insulting when we tell people over and over again to ask for help when we know that help is not available, when we know that people might just get a leaflet and be put on a years-long waiting list sometimes. Recently we saw Nikki Graham, a national celebrity, had to fundraise for medical costs for a serious mental illness. Things like this should not be happening, pandemic or not. Also, we care about mental health and we care about quality of services. Treating staff well and paying staff properly is absolutely vital. And I'm sure all of us will agree here that the 1% pay rise offer is once again absolutely insulting. And I'm glad that it's been mentioned that it's not just doctors, but also nurses, also cleaners, all the other support staff that keep our hospitals functioning. People who are often minority ethnic, migrant, outsourced, in many ways invisible, working long hours on poverty pay. That should not be happening. We've also learned a lesson about outsourcing, and the already mentioned infamous track and trace system being an example of how privatization is damaging our healthcare and health service. And we should not forget here the still existing danger of the US trade deal that threatens to give out more and more of our health service to private companies. And Tories refused over and over again to vote to take it off the table. So that's something to bear in mind, and I agree on the points about not just keeping our NHS public, but bringing the NHS back into public control. And the final point, a bit of a personal interest of migrants' rights. There are still people who are charged to use the NHS. It's not free for everyone. There are people who are scared to see a doctor or who now are scared to be vaccinated because of their immigration status, because they fear that if they do the right thing, if they see a doctor, they get a vaccine, they could be deported. And viruses don't check passports, so neither should our health service. And I think that's a message we should remember.
Thank you, Anna. So lastly, I'm going to come to Bob on this one. So Bob, obviously you work in the health service. You have experience directly of, I guess, the reforms and changes that have been brought in over the years. How would you like to see the NHS be rebuilt after COVID?
The short answer is it needs to be renationalized. We've had 4 decades of progressive restructures that have taken us further and further down the road to replicating the American system, which is privatized, and where the market doesn't work, the government funds through Medicare and Medicare services, which are still largely privately provided. That is the model we have been headed towards, and we are actually in the final straight. Anna mentioned the white paper that was produced earlier this year, and there's also talk about the trade bill. What I want to do is just explain what the threat is. The threat is with the creation within England of new bodies, which are called integrated care systems. And these are modeled on the American Health Maintenance Organization. Now that's a lot of jargon, but fundamentally what is happening at pace at the moment is the pooling of money that has historically been allocated to GPs based on their capitation list, the number of patients they have. There is a new financial framework being set up, which will in due course pool the funding, which used to go through your GP, and hand over control to the American insurance industry. Hand over financial budgetary control to predominantly a company called United Health in this country operating under the name of Optum. Now it's been quite useful about the controversy around Centene because it's made people scratch their heads in terms of what is a large American private insurer doing running surgeries. But in relative terms, that is a sideshow. The major game which is being played out is United Health's control of NHS funding flows. I couldn't disagree with the word that I've heard in terms of we need to protect staff, because that is a pretty medium-term threat that burnt out, demoralized, emotionally broken staff, particularly closer to retirement, are going to leave. You're going to have a massive organizational memory and brain drain out of the NHS. But that's not a problem for government, because one of the themes of the privatization is what's called de-skilling, replacing expensive qualified people with cheaper, less qualified substitutes. So the more of those people the government can drive out, that is seen as an advantage to the privatization. Somebody mentioned earlier about the student nurse bursaries. In 2016, we had an assault on the junior doctor's contract. Why are they doing this? The government's doing the heavy lifting to contract the NHS wage bill prior to handing over their employment status to the private companies. So once you understand what are the moves afoot and have a sort of a helicopter view of what's going on, then you can start to work out a strategy for defending and rebuilding. One thing that will happen with this budgetary concentration and the downskilling is the access everybody has had in this country to see a qualified doctor as their first port of call has effectively been done away with. And the coronavirus pandemic has provided an acceleration of that process. So for you to get to see a doctor face-to-face has been very difficult in the last 12 months. And it's being normalized. And you've got a generation of GPs who are overwhelmed. And some are seeing this as a temporary relief and maybe a permanent relief to some of their workload. Now, this is an absolute disaster for GPs, because in some way they're signing their own death warrant. If we start to accept that patients can just see anybody, irrespective of their qualification, and it's all equivalent, we are being nudged into accepting lower and lower standards. There was talk of bed losses. There have been at least 2,000 more bed closures since the pandemic. The contraction of the NHS continues. Meanwhile, to handle the pandemic, we bailed out all the private hospitals who only delivered 1/3 of the work that they were paid for. Now, these hospitals could have been nationalized and brought into the NHS, but that wouldn't do, because that goes against the economic and political ideology, which is neoliberalism which is to turn every asset this country has into an income generating profit stream, so that private corporations, not even based in this country, largely trying to avoid tax paying in this country, can siphon money away from providing care. And I'll leave you with this one thought. Within the new GP contract, which was forced through by our union without a ballot of the members in 2019, there's a clause which is called the shared savings scheme. And what this means is they're going to introduce an incentive for your GP to deny patients care that they need. And that is the American model. The less care you give, the more money you make. So we need to shout loud about the direction of travel. We're not far from it. And these changes will be locked in by legislative change and a US-UK trade deal. And then the game will be over. So we haven't got long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. I am going to move us straight on to our next question, actually, because we have 33 minutes left and we have two huge questions to get through. But before I do that, just to echo what Bob said there, in terms of shouting loud about this, there are lots of people that ought to know about what we've just been discussing and ought to hear the conversation we've just been having. Now, the best way that you can make sure that they hear the conversation that you've heard is to hit that share button if you're watching on Facebook, hit that subscribe button on YouTube, comment, tell us what you think as well. It helps us in the algorithm. It means that more people will see this conversation, more people will hear what our incredible panel have to say. Now, I am going to move us on to our next question because, as I said, we have two questions still to get through in 32 minutes now. And so I'm going to ask our panelists if they could be slightly briefer on these next two questions so that we don't end up running out of time for the final one. So I'm going to move us swiftly on to our next. And unless you've been living under a rock for the last few days, you will certainly have heard about the story in relation to Dodgy Dave's dealings with Greensill and the government. And so our next question this evening, which I'm going to put to Anna first, is what does the David Cameron Greensill scandal tell us about lobbying and corruption in the UK?
Well, I've got some strong feelings on this. I think I want to start by making some general points about corruption in the UK. Because when I moved to the UK 9 years ago, I was actually surprised how little role corruption plays in political debate. Across Europe, we've seen governments falling because of corruption. We've seen parties on the left, right, and center forming in Spain, in Poland, Italy, all over the continent, with an explicit pledge to tackle corruption. And actually, I've sometimes been a bit critical of overemphasizing that, because focusing on the kind of moral purity of politicians at the expense of ideology and systemic change can be a bit of a cop-out. Anti-corruption can be a slogan that can be filled with all kinds of political content, not necessarily progressive. But at the same time, I feel like the UK has taken the opposite approach, that our media and people are scared to even say the word. Last year when we seen the housing minister, Roman Jenrick, involved in the Westbury scandal, we heard the media talk about cash for favors, which sounds a lot like corruption to me, but no one was saying it. Was a scandal around COVID contracts and the government not just wasting public money, but putting lives at risks by handing lucrative contracts to their mates. We talked about cronyism, but corruption wasn't really mentioned very much. Now we talk about the lobbying scandal, and it feels like a lot of people are scared to call things by their proper name. But corruption is not just a kind of individual problem, as I mentioned. It is systemic. It's not always just kind of handing someone money in an envelope. It can be an appropriate use of a position of influence. It can be about nepotism. It can be mates rates. And to an extent, it is inevitable. In a system, we have a constant revolving door between high-level politics, lobbying, big business, often media. When we're ruled by an elite who often went to the same high school or a few high schools, people who are classmates, people who revolve in the same super rich circles over and over again. And I think that's a fundamental problem for our political and economic system. I want to see more MPs like Nadia Whittam, who 2 years ago was a care worker and who's putting herself forward for open selection every time to make sure she's connected to her community. And fewer MPs who, if they lose their jobs, they can tomorrow become a huge, high-paid lobbyist and advocate for precisely the opposite of what they've been saying all their lives. So I think like this is closely tied to inequality, is closely tied to our economic elite and where our MPs come from.
Thanks, Anna. So, Johnbosco, what do you make of this, and what do you think this reveals about the British state and corruption in British politics?
Well, I remember when this story first broke. I sent Chris a message, and I said, "Wow, this country has really gone down the drain," and and in some ways, I don't know, perhaps it was never not in the drain, as Anna just said, but it is quite possible that it's going further and further down. And I think that Anna just captured one of what I think is the primary problems with British democracy. And the British media is often extremely excited to identify this problem with in other countries. The BBC is going to be really keen to tell you about how there is corruption in Russia, and Vladimir Putin and his gang of oligarchs are controlling the country, and so on and so forth, which to some extent is true. I don't know enough about Russia. But it's pretty much exactly the same thing in Britain. And what's interesting, though, I think, is that it's a multinational effort here in Britain, as opposed to in Russia, where it's like a Russian effort. Here in Britain, it's like we have Russians actually involved here. Boris Johnson was selling out lunches to them some years ago, as some might remember. Right, so it's the British democracy is deeply corrupt, almost endemically. It's almost impossible to envision British democracy without the corruption, because, as I mentioned earlier, it might be that it has never not been in this state. So, I mean, there isn't very much I can say. I cannot tell you that it will get better, because it will not. But of course, people who oppose it should continue to fight it. I do not think that, and I think anybody would be silly to think that what happened to David Cameron, or the fact that it was exposed, suggests that this is rare. It is not at all rare. Of course, me being a bit of a conspiracy theorist probably believes that the fact that he was exposed has something to do with his relationship with Boris Johnson, the very fact that they're even launching an inquiry. So this is a problem that is at the very root of British democracy, and to the extent that it is possible to remove it, I think it will depend on people, everyone on this call, and everyone who's listening to us, and everyone in this country who believes that corruption kind of undermines our ability to provide the needs, the things that people need in society, because it leads, as we have been talking about, to people siphoning off money that should be used for providing for staff pay in the NHS, or mental health services for people that have really gone down bad during this pandemic. That money being siphoned off into the pockets of very few people. We ought to fight it.
Thank you, Johnbosco, for that. I'm going to come to Clare next. So Johnbosco said there that British democracy is deeply corrupt. Do you think that the David Cameron scandal is just reflective of what's become a norm in British politics and democracy?
Well, let's not kid ourselves with political funding. There has never been transparency around who funds political parties here in Northern Ireland. And my party, the Green Party, is the only party still to this day to publish all donations over £500, for example. So political transparency should be the cornerstone for politics at every level anyway, because people have to know where the influences are coming from. And I think that is just a very fundamental that we all need to get to. It wasn't until 2018 that Westminster eventually, after a huge amount of pressure, passed legislation that required political parties here in Northern Ireland to publish donations, but they wouldn't go far enough. And it was when James Brokenshire was the Secretary of State, and he didn't go far enough and call for that to be backdated, because the Westminster had said that they were going to make the move, but then they didn't deliver. And when they eventually did deliver it, it was a wee bit late in coming. So while it was passed in 2018, we've been calling for it for a long time. So it meant, for example, that the decision not to backdate meant that the donations, we've all heard about the Brexit referendum, for example, and the money that was coming in from different quarters there, and where it was going, and the dark money that was, allegedly paid to the DUP, for example, to campaign for a hard Brexit. But, because the Westminster didn't backdate the political donations transparency legislation, means that still to this day, we don't even know who funded the DUP. It's widely recognised that they received a lot of money from a group of business people you might have heard of called the Constitutional Research Council, to campaign. And they were caught campaigning, for example, in London, on the London Underground, on the streets of Edinburgh, for example, but not very much really here in Northern Ireland, where we know that the numbers were low and we didn't have the amount of votes to pass the referendum. So when we're talking about lobbying and corruption and political donations and transparency, you really don't have to look any further than Northern Ireland, where they're given legal duck and cover to continue with the system. So it's corrupt to its core. And until we have full accountable transparency, nothing's going to change. And we will never know who is influencing decision making at the very highest level of public office across the land.
Thank you, Claire. So finally bringing in Bob on this one.
Yeah, I think David Cameron's recent example shows that the rot goes all the way up to the top. Just want to remind people that, had he been successful in lobbying for this financial company, Greensill, it might have meant that he was going to receive £20 million personally. Now he's trading on his previous links to being in power, to being part of the Conservative Party, to advance the interests of private corporations. Now, by most people's definition, that is corruption, because it's not happening in the public interest. The Tory party go on about how they believe in the market and competition, yet for their own friends, they want to do deals behind closed doors without competition. Another scandal he was involved in was back in 2019, where he lobbied for a biotech company called Illumina, and they were awarded a £123 million contract to be part of the genomic coding research that's being done by the NHS. So that's just two examples with him, but it is far more widespread. So in terms of the NHS, how has the government managed to hoodwink the public and force through privatization without us all noticing? Well, you make sure you appoint all the leaders. So the leaders of the clinical commissioning groups, the leaders of the hospital trusts, unless they're on board, they won't get selected. And the idea that they were going to have an independent inquiry by some neutral, respectable person is laughable. But, just by sticking the word independent, they managed to hoodwink a lot of us. What is more dangerous is the weak opposition, the weak political opposition. None of the parties can really say we are completely untainted with corruption and doing favors for contact. So that is a problem in terms of exposing and dealing with this issue. But, unless and until we have clear rules that if you are serving in high office, you are banned from lobbying from private companies. You are banned from profiting personally by any activity you do out of office. This will not come to an end. So we need to recognize the other toxic relationship is between our politicians and largely a docile, compliant media. Now, it's good that the Times and other papers have exposed this, but generally speaking, in terms of the big picture on the NHS and the privatisation, they have been lamentable. So we need an independent press. We need to preserve the independence of the judiciary, which has been called into question over the Julian Assange case. And we need the politicians to commit to legislation which outlaws a lot of their dodgy behaviour. Now, I won't hold my breath on that one, but that's the hope.
Thank you, Bob. So I'm going to pause there in case there's anyone who wants to jump back in. But before I come to anyone who does want to jump back in, I just wanted to echo what Bob said at the end there around the need for free and independent media. And one outlet that is both free and certainly independent is Bright Green. We don't have the billionaire owners of the rest of the press. We don't have links and connections and cozy dinners with the Conservative Party. We are a voice of and for and by the left, and any support that you can give to Bright Green is hugely appreciated. If you are able to, please do go to bright-green.org/donate. We are entirely funded by generous people like you. I can't see anyone indicating that they want to jump back in on this question, so I'm going to move us on to our final question, which was very much in the headlines for the last week or so, until a series of other events have kind of kicked it out of the front pages, at least on the British mainland, but it comes in the aftermath of violence that we've seen resurging across particularly loyalist areas in Northern Ireland, particularly around Belfast, but also elsewhere. And the question is, does the recent violence in Northern Ireland show that the Good Friday Agreement has failed? And I'm going to bring in Claire first on this one.
Thanks very much. No, it doesn't. What it shows is that we've had a political process without a peace process, and that couldn't be made any more apparent than what we have been seeing on our streets over the past few weeks. And the recent violence really shows that the Good Friday Agreement has yet to be fully implemented, and that Brexit is bad for Northern Ireland, and that a Tory-led hard Brexit is an absolute disaster for Northern Ireland. And we've had the DUP stand shoulder to shoulder with the ERG and other hard Brexiteers and campaigning for the Brexit in their image. And some of those MPs and MLAs declared that they didn't care what Brexit looked like as long as Brexit was done. Well, you know, now Brexit is done and they don't like the outcome. And what we're seeing is working class loyalist communities who are deprived, who living in deprived areas and you know, largely forgotten communities, are being goaded through a whole series of events, that their British identity is now being eroded and under threat, and that we're now seeing an economic united Ireland, and that Protestant people are now being treated as second-class citizens. But this is all the spin to cover up exactly what the DUP campaigned for, and they're deflecting by absolving themselves of all responsibility for creating the very situation that we just mentioned in the last questions, where they were taking huge sums of money to campaign for. But you know, I remember this week 23 years ago, the signing of the Good Friday Agreement happened. And while, of course, it wasn't perfect, it was right. And it still remains as an absolutely critical framework for peace and security across this island. It's 23 years in its making, but really what we've had in those 20 years since from our traditional parties has been, you know, a whole series of disasters again. You know, we've had the suspension of the institution from 2002 to 2007, where they came back with the St Andrews Agreement that was signed off by themselves in 2006, but actually, you know, fundamentally changed the Good Friday Agreement without the consent of people. And then we've had the Stormont House Agreement in 2014, In and Out Ministers in 2015, Fresh Start Agreement in 2015, and then Sinn Féin DUP only executive in 2016, leading to its collapse again, and coming back in January 2020 with the New Decade New Approach deal, and then facing the realities of Brexit and dealing with COVID. So I think that you really have to get into the root causes here as well and understand in its entirety what it was that was meant to be delivered with the Good Friday Agreement. And the promise of prosperity, for example, has not been delivered. The same areas that were most deprived 23 years ago remain the same that are most deprived today. And while the Assembly has even failed to deliver real tangible change on the ground, we are still a deeply divided society. We have segregated communities and segregated education systems. We are an environmental wasteland. We have an epidemic in poverty and disadvantage, unacceptable levels of poor mental health. We've not invested in integration, but opted instead for this shared future notion. And we still build everything on a sense of two communities, us and them, loyalist and Republican, Catholic and Protestant, but completely ignoring what I feel awfully termed as others, the otherings. But at the same time, throughout all this process, we have never demilitarized, we've never demobilized or reintegrated paramilitaries. And we also look to Westminster in order to try and advance any type of equality legislation for people. So in short, I would say that we've had a political process with the institutions and getting them up and going and trying to keep them up and going, but not a peace process. And that's the problem. And we have, now got to the stage where it's even harder to achieve because of the systemic problems of inequality and inequity as well. And let's, face the very fact that we seen our own Black Lives Matter protest, just like, you've seen throughout the rest of GB. We seen our own women protests, same as you did in the rest of GB. But those groups didn't go and burn the city down because, they felt threatened or their identity was under attack, or, that they felt like they were being treated as second-class citizens. But the response that I'm hearing from those within those communities is that, they want their differences, for example, to be celebrated and not picked apart or used to divide us, for example. So, this week we are marking the 23rd anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. So it's really, really time that we need to stop, take stock, reaffirm our commitment to the people's agreement that was the Good Friday Agreement, and ensure that it is implemented in full in all its parts and that society is brought with us. Because Northern Ireland is not settled. We remain a place apart, and the British and the Irish governments have washed their hands of getting involved here for a long, long time. And what we're seeing is easily manipulated communities who have been disenfranchised and, using young people, there's, children as young as 13 being arrested on our streets right now for the disorder and the violence that we're seeing. This Good Friday Agreement is 23 years old. That's a huge disparity in terms of one and the other, for example, but manipulation, we have built sectarianism and that division right into the heart of our institutions. So for example, when I'm first elected, the first day that I take my seat at the Assembly, I'm required to sign up from sign the register, and I have to sign my name, Clare Bailey, from the Green Party. My constituency is South Belfast, and then I am required to designate myself as a nationalist or a unionist. And because I do not identify with either of those identities, I put myself down as a feminist. But the system does not compute what that is, so I am automatically deemed as other. So this division of nationalist and unionist is at the very, very heart of our institutions. We have a 5-party power sharing model. So those are parties from, 2 nationalists, 2 unionists, and 1 other in there who will never agree on a way forward. And it's, it's easier for them to, just regurgitate the trauma that has never been dealt with the legacy of our past, and get people worked up on that, bring the bogeyman out from the cupboard, basically, and that's what we're seeing. So this is not that the Good Friday Agreement has failed, it is that the Good Friday Agreement has not been delivered, has not been implemented in all its parts, and we need to get back to the heart of that.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that. So, Anna, I'm going to bring you in next on this one. And that last thing that Claire said, I think, is a nice segue over to you, which is do you think that, as Claire said, that the problem is the Good Friday Agreement has not been delivered rather than the Good Friday Agreement itself in terms of the context of what we've seen over the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, definitely wouldn't say that the concerning events of the past few weeks meant the Good Friday Agreement has failed. I think more than anything else, they're a reminder that peace in Northern Ireland is precious, is fragile, and it's something that should not be taken for granted. And, there's obviously a lot that Momentum member are criticizing New Labour for. But I think it's, credit where due, it is a miracle that people my generation or younger have lived without the kind of constant fear of immediate violent conflict. And by a miracle, of course, I mean something that requires a lot of hard work, a lot of goodwill, and a lot of difficult but necessary compromises. And peace in Ireland is something that should not be played fast and loose with, which Boris Johnson has unfortunately done throughout the Brexit process. Of course, the recent unrest is not just caused by Brexit. There has been issues around an IRA funeral, perceptions of double standards in policing, and of course, years and decades of underlying tensions. But Brexit, and a Tory hard Brexit, as has already been said, has exacerbated these problems. A central promise of the Leave campaign, of the Tories, of Boris Johnson specifically, has been that the UK can leave the single market without a hard border on the island of Ireland, which was always an arrogant and false promise. I mean, Boris Johnson confidently said that there will not be a hard border, but this is not exactly what's happened, as we know. I mean, Northern Ireland has been separated from Britain, which many people in loyalist and unionist communities have seen as a kind of attack on their identity, but it's also led to economic disruption. It's led to disruption to businesses, to jobs, to delivery of products, and that kind of disregard for promises made and for peace has undermined trust. Of course, we need to mention economic deprivation as well. I think it's no coincidence that a lot of the violence has been happening in areas that are already economically deprived. And while economic justice is not as sufficient to guarantee peace, I think it is an important part of the peace process. And peace, as Claire has mentioned, is an ongoing process. It's, national, cultural, religious identities are inherently complex questions. They change, they evolve. The relationship between Northern Ireland and Britain might change over time, but it's hugely important that we approach these sensitive topics with respect and an atmosphere of dialogue, and that is unfortunately not what the Tories have been doing.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm going to rush over to our next panelist so we can get everyone in on this last question and bring Bob in next on this one.
I'm no expert on Northern Ireland politics, but I certainly do remember the Troubles when I was younger, and it was horrifying to see the return of the street scenes that we did witness. But I can't add too much to what Claire and Anna have said, other than our politicians in Northern Ireland need to see beyond their own narrow political interest and rise up and look at what's in the interest of the whole community, and scapegoating each other for trying to distract from the disastrous hard Brexit, which has been then compounded by the coronavirus, is very short term and very dangerous. And the quicker they return to implementing the peace process, the better.
Thanks, Bob. And finally, over to Johnbosco to finish us off on our final question.
Yeah, just like Bob just said, I'm no expert in Northern Irish politics at all. I think that Claire sounded extremely sensible in what she said, and it struck me as quite right that the government has appeared to pay a great deal of attention to the political process of spent quite a lot of the last 2 decades congratulating themselves about achieving the Good Friday Agreement. But they haven't really done very much to ameliorate a lot of the inequalities that people have been identifying. I would just speak from experience as as a Nigerian man who comes from a tribe in Nigeria that fought a war for 6 years, designed to cut us off from Nigeria. And just to say that I think it's probably something that the left, but here in the United Kingdom and in the Republic of Ireland, has failed to do, and that is kind of bring out the class element of all of the identities that run across Ireland. The children who have been firebombing infrastructure in parts of Northern Ireland share a great deal with children, Catholic Republican children, who also experience a lot of the inequalities that they do. And being a part of a united Ireland or being a part of the United Kingdom is not going to solve any of those things by themselves. And I think that the left has not done, the left has, in my experience at least, the left has appeared to just pretty much sided with one side, whereas the right has sided with the other side. Whereas I think there's a very good left-wing case to be made for simply cutting right across those quote-unquote identity differences instead of essentializing them, essentially pulling across them and bringing people together on the basis of those people sharing material interests.
Thank you so much, Johnbosco, and thank you to all of our panel. Unfortunately, our time for this evening is up. Obviously, all the conversations we've been having this evening, we could have spoken about for the full 90 minutes, for the next 3 days, for the next week. They're huge topics, and we've only scratched the surface of them. But all the contributions from our panel I found incredibly insightful and engaging and informative. And I hope that everyone watching has too. I just have a few final things to say before we wrap up for this evening and you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. The first thing just to say is a massive thank you to everyone who has joined us on Zoom. It's always wonderful to see faces on these calls to make you know that you are really speaking to real humans rather than numbers that appear on a Facebook live stream. So thank you very much for joining us on Zoom. Thank you to everyone who has joined us on Facebook, including those who have stuck it out the whole way through and haven't faced that temptation to scroll through the feed. You've stuck with us. Thank you so much for that. It's not too late to hit that share button and get more of your friends watching it. So please do that if you can. And of course, thank you to those of you who have been watching on YouTube. As always, please do hit that subscribe button. Let us know what you've thought about the conversation in the comments down below. Make sure you like the video and make sure you share it. It means that more people will watch it. If you've enjoyed this conversation, somebody you know will. So hit the share button wherever you are watching. Now, a few final bits and pieces just to let you know. The first of them is that this event is part of a wider series of debates. And we have the next of them coming up in just 2 weeks' time. Each of these debates takes place on every second Tuesday. And our 6th episode of the Bright Green Debates is on April 27th. And we have an absolutely incredible panel joining us for that. We have the Labour MP, Rachel Maskell. We also have the Green Party councillor in Bristol, Cleo Lake. And we have the Executive Director of War on Want, Assad Raymond, joining us in 2 weeks' time. There'll be a link in the Zoom chat shortly, and also where you're watching on Facebook and YouTube. I also just wanted to do another plea. As before, Bright Green, as you know, is an independent publication. We want to put on more events like this. We want to publish more articles that contribute to debates on the left, that help to start to mainstream discussions around left-wing ideas and ideals. The only way we can do that is if more people are able to dig deep and donate to us and make sure that we can grow, run more events, publish more articles, and continue to expand our influence. Please do head to bright-green.org/donate if you've enjoyed this conversation this evening and want to see more of them. And then the final thing just to say is that you can catch us on all social media channels, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube. I lied, you can't catch us on all channels. We're not on TikTok yet, but maybe if you donate, I can hire a TikTok consultant who can transform Bright Green social media and take us to the next level. But all of our links to our social media are in the chat. They're in the comments on Facebook, in the description on YouTube. Please do like, follow, subscribe, whatever the terminology is on the platform you're on, and you'll never miss anything that we do. So the final thing, just to say, one last final thing, is a massive thank you again to our panel. Please do find them on social media, follow them, stay in touch with them. They're all incredible. And I hope you've enjoyed what they've had to say this evening. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday evenings. Thank you so much, and goodbye.